Delays are temporary, but perfection is forever, on this final episode of Good Nintentions 1985. Once again, Nintendo debuted the NES in America in October 1985, as a limited, high-risk release in a handful of New York-based retailers. Yet that's not how the company had wanted to introduce the system to the US. Had Nintendo been in proper possession of its druthers, the NES would have arrived a year sooner, and all across the country, all at once. Retailers were having none of it though, so what was destined to be the most popular game system of the 80s had to earn its right to national distribution through a grassroots campaign. The NES took so long in coming to the US, in fact, that by the time it arrived in full force, its replacement had already launched in Japan. The console, known there as the family computer, had been on the market for 3 years and was beginning to look long in the tooth by fall 1985, especially as its cart-based games weren't evolving to properly reflect the shifting technology of the era, limited as they were by both cartridge memory capacity and hardware restrictions. So, even as Nintendo's engineers were redesigning the Japanese Famicom to become the American NES, they were also putting together the Famicom Disk System. That's a tale for another time, but the basic idea behind the disk system was that it would expand the capabilities of the console by adding a higher capacity storage medium, enable persistent data saves, and add new hardware features such as an extra audio channel for music. Naturally, Nintendo put its top men on the task of coming up with showcase software for the disk system. The peripheral's first big games came from both Shigeru Miyamoto, who would design The Legend of Zelda, and Gunpei Yokoi, whose first disk system games would be Metroid and Kid Icarus. These three games represented a fundamental shift in Nintendo's internal development ethos. Unlike the quick-fix, action-driven Famicom games that had come before, they would be massive RPG-inflected adventures that demanded players record their progress for play across multiple sessions. These games were part of a general zeitgeist toward deeper, more expansive home gaming experiences, the same trend that gave us Dragon Quest. The shift would have happened without the disk system. In fact, Dragon Quest games never appeared on disk system, but certainly the new add-on hastened the transition. Nintendo's developers recognized the sea change represented by the disk system and fully anticipated making the leap from carts to discs. The majority of first-party Famicom releases for the next few years would appear exclusively on diskette. And so, as these creators prepared to leave behind carts for the fertile pastures of magnetic media, Miyamoto's team decided to bid farewell to the old ways with a creation that, in his own words, was meant to be the ultimate cartridge game: Super Mario Bros. Nintendo surely felt regret and frustration that it wasn't able to export its console to the world's largest consumer market until its successor had nearly arrived in Japan. Nevertheless, that setback may have been the NES's saving grace, because it meant the console debuted after Super Mario Bros. Had arrived. As a result, the NES had a true top-tier system seller when it reached America. Had the system launched in 1984, it would have had some decent games to go along with it. Some sports games, the Zapper trilogy, possibly everything up through Clu Clu Land and Excitebike. We would not, however, have seen Super Mario Bros. Until the following year. That would have been a terrible shame, because without that masterpiece, the NES had little to truly set it apart from the failed consoles of the early 80s. It had nicer graphics than Intellivision, sure. Light gun games? Definitely. But Super Mario Bros. Was truly a game changer, a work that represented a genuine generational change from the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision. The phrase best game ever has been thrown around so often and so casually to have lost any real sense of meaning. But in 1985, you legitimately could have made that claim about Super Mario Bros. Without drifting into the realm of hyperbole. It genuinely did stand head and shoulders above pretty much every other game published to that point. Super Mario Bros. Achieved the elusive hat trick of game design. It represented a tremendous technical feat, it looked fantastic, and it played almost perfectly. The game soared in every imaginable respect. It can be difficult more than 30 years later to fully appreciate just how mind-blowing Super Mario Bros. Truly was circa 1985. The game has been so widely referenced, imitated, and iterated upon that it has lost some of its specialness. But if you ever have the chance, sit down sometime with an NES, a copy of the game, and a decent CRT tube television. clear your mind, forget about the many and varied sequels the game has seen, and take a fresh look at the original Super Mario Bros. The NES could have succeeded in America without Super Mario Bros. The Famicom certainly did in Japan, but with Super Mario Bros., it couldn't have failed. It exists as a sort of bookend, paired with Donkey Kong, that game's spiritual counterpart. That's not just because of the Mario connection, or because each game bore the brunt of selling the hardware in different territories. Rather, they're connected on a more functional level. Nintendo designed the NES hardware to play a near-perfect game of Donkey Kong, and they designed Super Mario Bros. To push the NES hardware to its innate limits. Super Mario Bros. Is literally as good a game as can possibly exist on stock NES hardware. The Famicom Disk System, with its expanded memory and audio capabilities, would be along shortly after Mario's debut. And a few months after that, the first game powered by the advanced UN-ROM chip would appear in Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, allowing NES software to stretch the capabilities of the console beyond its basic limits by offloading some of the work to cartridges. Super Mario Bros., however, accomplished its greatness within the same boundaries as, say, baseball or ice climber. It presented a breathtaking leap forward in terms of scope, consisting of 32 multi-screen stages packed in turn with dozens of hidden areas. It featured the best-looking graphics to date on NES, and perhaps most importantly, it introduced just absolutely perfect control and physics. There are a very few moments in video game history that you can point to and say, this is where everything changed. Super Mario Bros. Is one of them. Let's talk about the control and physics first, because the sheer joy of playing Super Mario Bros. Was probably the game's most important point. Up until now, platformers tended to be fussy, awkward, and clumsy, even those developed internally at Nintendo. Donkey Kong was fine in 1981 with its simple jump arc and unforgivingly fatal height penalties, but the genre barely improved over the course of the next 4 years. Look at 1983's Mario Bros., or even Ice Climber, debuting just half a year before Super Mario Bros. In both of those games, leaping feels stiff, clumsy, imprecise, an especially egregious failing in Ice Climber, which revolves entirely around leaping and ascent. And competitors' games were no better. Run and jump games simply weren't that fun to play. Super Mario Bros. Changed that, turning the simple act of platforming into sheer pleasure. Mario moves with greater sophistication and subtlety than any hero before him, and it completely changes the nature of play, and would influence hundreds, thousands of games to come in the following decades. For starters, Mario's jump had a variable height. Though players have only a single digital button with which to command Mario to jump, the act of pressing the button is an analog process. The longer you hold down the A button, the more force the game applies to Mario's leap. A quick tap will cause Mario to perform a short hop, but sustaining your button press until Mario lands will cause him to gain as much height or distance as possible. Those factors too prove to be variable. Unlike in his previous outings, Super Mario no longer finds himself constrained by the realities of physics and motion. In Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., our hero found himself limited to the arc of a jump based on his position and movement at the moment he left the ground. A forward leap would take him the same distance forward every time. With Super Mario Bros.' more complex physics, however, players have the ability to alter Mario's momentum and direction in midair. Hop straight up in Donkey Kong and you can only jump straight up. Hop straight up in Super Mario Bros., on the other hand, and you can bend Mario's path through the air by pressing the controller in one direction or the other. You can even move in both directions in succession during a single jump, which proves to be the key to making incredibly precise movements to ascend to a platform directly above Mario's head as he stands precariously at the edge of a pit. The amount of nuance and fine-tuning possible in Mario's aerial movements here was truly revolutionary, and they could be modified even further than by simply altering their duration, height, and direction. Mario served a master called inertia, and the momentum of one action carried into the next. This lent Mario's movements even greater nuance. Jumping forward while walking would allow you to cover more distance than jumping forward from a dead stop, but even that would give Mario greater forward clearance than if you leapt straight upward and curled your jump arc ahead while in midair. And that wasn't the extent of it. Super Mario Bros. Gave its hero a run button to add further variance to his movements. By holding down the B button, Mario would dash rather than walk, building up speed over the space of about 1/2 screen length. Besides being handy for evading enemies and pursuing turtle shells in pursuit of chain counter score bonuses leading to 1-ups, Mario's dash ability also fed into the physics of his leaps. While a walking jump could give him some respectable forward clearance, a running jump would send him sailing forward. And as with his normal leaps, players could control Mario's dash jumps in midair, pressing forward to squeeze every last pixel of momentum out of it, letting go of the A button to cut a leap short, or pulling back on the D-pad to alter the trajectory of his movement. The end result turned Mario into the most fluid, graceful, versatile hero video gaming had ever seen. And inertia didn't just dictate Mario's jump physics, but his movements in general. He would continue to move once players let up on the D-pad, running out his momentum over the space of a ground block or so. The faster Mario moved, the greater the distance he needed to come to a full stop. Nintendo and other developers had experimented with this concept before, but Mario made it an essential consideration for players. Not only did they have to master jumping, but landing too. Stopping well became an important part of moving well. The game cleverly emphasized this with a visual hint. When players brought a speedy Mario to a summary halt, he would lean back into his movement with a cartoonish animation reminiscent of old Warner Bros. Cartoons. In short, Mario's physics weren't realistic, but they were convincing. It takes players a moment to get a handle on how this hero moves and stops, but it quickly becomes second nature, and you'll constantly intuit new tricks and techniques as you play. The credit for Mario's incredible, convincing, immersive handling belongs to the most unsung member of the development team, programmer Toshihiko Nakago. While Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka may have called the shots regarding Super Mario's game design, Nakago interpreted their concepts into code and created a sophisticated game that was truly and simply a joy to play. Which is not to say Super Mario Bros. Is without its flaws. The tiny dev team crammed a huge, ambitious game into a tiny cartridge. That was the entire point of the venture, really. And it's impossible to perform a feat like that without encountering a few bumps along the way. It's also impossible for a game to become a hit on this order without being wrung inside out by eager players. And Super Mario Bros. Fans quickly shone light into its most troubled corners. Precise as the game seemed, it contains minor bugs. Collision errors, for example. Vertical surfaces aren't unbroken, but rather can interact with Mario at a single pixel of their topmost exposed corner. This allows talented players to perform wall jumps by pressing jump at the exact frame at which Mario snags on scenery. Mario's uncanny array of skills, such as jumping, ducking, sliding, and flinging fireballs, can be combined in unexpected permutations with unintended effects. And the game doesn't deal well with 8-bit buffer overruns, which means that if you earn enough lives, you'll eventually flip back around to 0 and earn a game over. And yet, such was Super Mario's excellence that most people don't care about these quirks. On the contrary, they've become integral parts not only of the game's legacy, but of the lore of gaming in general. For example, interact with a block just so outside the secret warp zone area in World 1-2, and instead of finding the expected warps to Worlds 2, 3, and 4, you'll instead find only one pipe, designated World blank-1. Most people read that as -1, and thus the term minus world entered the pop culture lexicon. This was a defect rather than a secret, the game struggling to deal with an unforeseen outcome and barfing up garbled data at players and trapping them in an infinite loop. But it's become a beloved element of the game. It inspired players' imaginations, leading them to wonder what other secrets might be hidden within. And the discovery that the later disk system port of the game contained entirely different minus worlds due to the difference in data storage structures only fueled that fevered curiosity. It didn't hurt that Mario contained secrets in abundance, often so obscure in nature that the notion of the glitches being deliberate didn't seem unreasonable. You probably weren't meant to wall jump or get infinite lives by hopping on that specific turtle. But then again, the landscape was littered with hidden rooms and invisible blocks, and sometimes fireworks would mysteriously appear when you completed a stage for no visible rhyme or reason. So who could really say? Super Mario Bros. Offered a multi-layered game experience. It's not enough that the game contained a whopping 32 levels. Many of them featured hidden areas and alternate routes. And while it's true that 32 stages may not seem like that much in terms of raw numbers, the nature of those stages set Super Mario apart. I mean, Wrecking Crew had 100 stages, but each of those levels consisted of 2 screens, tightly packed with features and hazards. Super Mario Bros. Was one of the first games to decompress game design, stretching it beyond a single contained space. Compare the game to its predecessor Donkey Kong, which helped establish and typify the clear-the-board game design that ruled before Super Mario Bros. Debuted. Donkey Kong crams numerous hazards into its 4 individual screens. Super Mario, on the other hand, doles those obstacles out across a landscape where scrolling forward constantly introduces you to new situations. We saw the roots of this sort of design in games like Atari's Pitfall and in the Manic Miner sequels and clones that dominated 8-bit microcomputers in Europe. But the introduction of scrolling changed the feel of the affair. Pitfall and Jet Set Willy presented each of their hundreds of screens as a new standalone challenge, generally placing its primary obstacles, a pool filled with alligators, a scorpion, a pit, in the center of each new screen. Super Mario didn't have to observe such strict demarcations. One danger could lead into the next, meaning you might escape a Hammer Brother only to encounter a pit that could only be traversed by hopping on a spring. But the Hammer Brother still existed behind you in that same contiguous space. Even if it didn't actually pursue you to the pit, the impression of its presence and proximity exerted a subtle urgency that drove players forward even more effectively than the timer counting down at the top of the screen. The scrolling design also allows for more stressful, sustained scenarios, like Lakitu dogging Mario's every step and carpet bombing him with spiny eggs for an entire stage. or the post-aquatic bridge stages, in which an endless succession of flying fish leap from the water, homing in on Mario, forcing him to make a mad dash for the end. Nintendo didn't invent scrolling. Super Mario Bros. Was preceded by landmark scrolling titles such as Moon Patrol and Pac-Land, and the game debuted pretty much simultaneously with Capcom's similarly ambitious arcade cabinet Ghosts and Goblins, which allowed players to backtrack. Mario didn't. Still, Super Mario Bros. Did something none of those games could claim as of September 1985. It presented scrolling platformer action on a home console. Again, this was the game the NES hardware was ultimately designed for. Thanks to the hardware's support for scrolling, Mario could venture forward through a continuous world, and players could learn the ins and outs of the Mushroom Kingdom on their own terms. The developers packed the game as densely as possible with content. The 4 stages within each of the 8 game worlds follows a sort of pattern: an overworld level, an underground scene, an action-heavy scenario, followed by a claustrophobic, trap-laden castle that ends in a Bowser showdown. There's remarkable variety within that structure, and a great sense of rising and falling difficulty. A world's second level is typically much more challenging than its first, with the third offering a mild respite, before reaching the ominous danger of a Bowser castle. Mario was like G.I. Joe, fighting for freedom wherever there's trouble over land and sea and air. Mario could run like a pro, and sometimes he could find hidden vines leading to bonus worlds in the sky. Sometimes he had to swim, paddling underwater with excellent control physics that the Mario team gleaned from Satoru Iwata's work on Balloon Fight. Water changed the rules of the game, as Mario could no longer defeat enemies by striking them from above. In the sea creature's home turf, they had the advantage on Mario. You could only hope to outswim them, using the game's y-axis in a different way than was possible in terrestrial levels where gravity ruled the day. Or you could blast them with fireballs, assuming you could hang on to the requisite power-up long enough, that is. Mario's team turned the limitations of cartridges into an advantage time and again. In order to cram 32 huge stages into a ROM whose file size was smaller than the script for this video episode, the dev team had to duplicate content. Their solution was to turn that repeat material into iterative challenges that created a sensation of ramping complexity. For example, Bowser's first castle layout in World 1-1 showed up again toward the end of the game as World 6-4, but in a far more challenging form. What had appeared as empty blocks in World 1-4 suddenly had twirling fireballs attached to them in 6-4, sweeping through the air and forcing Mario to make nimble, precise leaps to avoid getting toasted. Meanwhile, Podobo fireballs suddenly leapt from fiery surfaces where none had been present before, and Bowser himself added a stream of hammer projectiles to his bag of tricks. Likewise, Worlds 7-2 and 7-3 amounted to a redux of 2-2 and 2-3, forcing players to navigate a lake followed by a hectic bridge. But despite their identical layouts, 7-2 featured many more bloober squids that would seek out and actively harry Mario, whereas 2-3 had largely been dominated by plodding, passive Cheep Cheep fish. But the Cheep Cheeps came out in force for the subsequent bridge stage. The difference in 7-3 was that they appeared in far greater numbers than in 2-3, and now they were accompanied by a variety of Koopa Troopas patrolling the bridge, meaning the run-like-mad approach that could whisk players safely through 2-3 had to be mitigated with an element of caution lest they dash into the bounding beak of a paratroopa. And then of course there were the maze stages. Levels 4-4, 7-4, and 8-4 could only be mastered by navigating the passages within in the proper order. These grew considerably in complexity, culminating in 8-4's maddening pipe maze, which forced players to play roulette in hopes of uncovering the route forward to the true and final showdown with Bowser. The game's iterative design worked in other even more clever ways too. The devs added the game's famous warp zones as a concession for its home console nature. Since they didn't need to worry about extracting a steady drip of quarters from players, they could afford to offer shortcuts so advanced players didn't have to repeat every single level every time they played. While this does have the unfortunate side effect of turning worlds 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7 into flyover states of a sort, I mean, when was the last time you played through World 7? The power to advance so rapidly had to be earned and learned. You can only reach the first warp zone at the end of 1-2 by breaking the game, using an elevator platform to leap outside the scenery and run along the top of the screen. This will take you past the pipe to 1-3 and into a special room where 3 pipes lead you to worlds 2-1, 3-1, or 4-1. It's a nice secret, hidden but not impossible to find. After playing for a while, everyone begins to wonder what lies beyond the flagpoles at the end of each stage, or what would happen if you jumped on top of the ceiling in the underground. It turns out the answer to that last question is you can skip a lot of stages. Nintendo predicted players' bad behavior and rewarded them for it. They did it again at the end of the second big underground stage, 4-2. Here again, you can skip past the pipe to the flagpole and find a warp zone. Shockingly though, this one only contains a single lonely pipe leading to World 5-1. Skipping ahead a mere 2 levels doesn't seem worth it really, but that's because the real 4-2 warp zone is hidden earlier in the level behind a complex series of invisible blocks that lead to a vine to a secret place in the clouds. Even if you manage to uncover the blocks, you still have to hit them in a certain order to prevent being locked away from the vine. And this, I think, perfectly embodies the underlying cleverness of Super Mario Bros., the innate brilliance of its design. The creators set out to produce the biggest, best platformer they possibly could, and then, despite sharp restrictions of time and memory space, they managed to integrate not only secrets, but tricks and traps based around the actual play patterns and reasoning of players. All of this in an adventure featuring beautiful, colorful visuals, crisp sound effects, and catchy syncopated music. And of course, iconic characters and concepts. About all Super Mario Bros. Takes from its predecessor Mario Bros. It's its hero, some pipe and turtle imagery, coins, and the idea of jumping and punching blocks. Everything else debuts here, invented whole cloth. Starman, Bowser, Goombas, Toads, Princess Peach, super mushrooms, and fire flowers. The imagery and mechanics that debuted in this game have survived through 3 decades, not just in sequels, but through an infinite array of imitators or games simply built on these principles. Not out of any derivative intent, but because Super Mario Bros. Laid the basis for the workings of video games in general. It's absolutely one of the true all-time greats in the medium, and it helped catapult the NES to global domination. Super Mario Bros. Was designed to make the most of the NES's innate power, but the NES benefited far more from the power of Super Mario Bros.